Welcome to part 4 of our pictorial whole cloth quilt. Trapunto, according to Webster's dictionary, is a decorative quilting design in high relief worked through at least 2 layers of cloth by outlining the design in running stitch and patting it from the underside. When I first did trapunto, that's exactly how I did it. I would stitch around the design that I wanted to have puffed up, and when that was done, I would turn it to the back and make tiny slits and then take batting and shove it through those tiny slits until I would get that relief off of the fabric that I was looking for. This was definitely a harder method than what we're going to learn today, because it was real hard to keep the batting nice and smooth as you were shoving this extra stuff in your design. But today, let's learn the easy way. We don't need to go through all that and have a mess on the back when we're done. Here's a look into the future of this quilt and what we want it to look like. So we need to analyze it. So let's take a look at this design. What part of the scene do we want to have relieved or raised up? Of course, we want that big pine tree to stand out, and probably the tree behind that. Of course, we'd want the church or the cabin, depending on which one you're doing. There's a smaller tree behind the church and in front of the church that we'd want to have raised up. We'd want to raise up the frame as well. And you know what? I really want nice fluffy snow. So I think those are the areas we're going to raise up. So it might be easier to show you what we do not want to raise up. So basically when we're finished, this is what we're going to end up doing trapunto under. All the sky and the small twigs and branches and the scrub brush, that's all going to be just regular quilting underneath that. But the big pine tree, the big tree, the small tree beside that, the church, the snow, and the frame will all be trapuntoed. It boils down to everything that is showing in this photo in white will have the extra batting behind it. Now for those doing the cabin in the woods, we have basically the same thing. We're going to trapunto under the large pine tree, the large tree in the background, the small tree beside that, the cabin, and the frame. Oh, and we can't forget the snow as well. So just like those doing the church, you'll have the same scenario where everything shown here in this photo in white is going to have the extra batting behind it. Everything else will be regular quilting. Now, one of the things that you have to consider when you're doing a whole cloth quilt is texture. Do you see how the big pine tree is sitting on top of the frame? I'd like to add some texture to that tree, but in order to do that, I really have to do that before I trapunto the rest of it. If I don't add that texture first, it's no longer going to be sitting on top of the frame. Instead, it's going to sink into the background with everything else. So for this first part of the trapunto, we're going to use a layer or 2 of batting under just the tree itself. Now this doesn't look too pretty from the get-go, but what we're trying to do is to give the simulation of pine needles behind all the snow that's laying on the branches. Now I'm doing this in green just so that you can see the stitching and how it's done. It's almost like thread painting, but I'm calling this thread sketching. We're just trying to give the illusion of the pine needles. And when you stitch this in your thread that is matching your fabric, it will look so much better than this, trust me. But you can take a look at this for a while so that you can see how this thread sketching is done. As you're stitching these needles, you want to turn your stitching in the direction where the needles would actually fall on a tree. So in other words, when you get close to the edge, you want to go in that same angle that the needles would naturally grow on a tree. And it's just to add a little realism. Your thread in the same color will not show up nearly as much a contrast as this is, but the thread will pick up the light and add just a little bit of sparkle to the tree. The other thing that this does, as you're pushing down the batting where the needles are, where you're doing your thread sketching, you're also pushing that batting up underneath the areas where the snow is laying on the branches. You'll see in just a moment. So now I think you can see the method behind my madness. I have the illusion of pine needles, but I have also puffed out all that snow that's laying on the branches. It doesn't look too awful bad in the green, but it's a lot more subtle when you stitch it in the same thread color that you're using for your quilt. You can see the slight sparkle and the texture this adds. When you're completely done stitching your pine needles, now it's time to turn it over and start trimming away your excess batting, trimming very close to the tree stitching line, but being careful not to cut your fabric. Now everybody wants to know what scissors I use when I'm doing this trimming. My favorite pair is the pair on the top. It's a bent scissor with a blunt tip, almost like a school scissor. That way it doesn't get caught in the batting as I'm trimming. The duckbill scissors on the left are good because it keeps you from accidentally cutting your fabric. And of course, last but not least, are my little tiny titanium scissors with a very sharp point. This is good for getting into fine areas. Coming up next, now we're going to pin the polyester batting or whatever batting you've decided to use for your trapunto to your quilt top. Get it all pinned in place so that we can begin stitching. In this shot, you can really see how the batting is already under the tree. This tree will be puffed up even more with the addition of the extra batting we're using now. I had mentioned in our last video that you might want to use water-soluble thread in this step. This will help to prevent the buildup of extra thread because you'll be stitching around these areas more than once. What happens with this water-soluble thread is simply that it disappears when it's wet. It just goes away. This illustration is for both the church and the cabin, and the lines in red are your stitching lines. This will also be in your handout material for reference. So we've switched over to water-soluble thread and we're now ready to stitch. Basically, you're stitching around everything that is touching the sky and touching the outer part of the frame. Now I shot some video of me tracing around the red-lined areas that I showed you in your illustration of what's supposed to be stitched, so it will have trapunto or extra padding underneath it. So I'm going to go ahead and speed this up so that you can see it. I think you can follow the lines just fine. There's a couple places that I'll slow it down and explain something to you, but other than that, enjoy. Do you notice how I'm always making a frame of my hands, and when I run out of that frame room, I stop and reposition? That helps to keep everything smooth on the top and the bottom while I'm stitching. Now, I have to advise you that before I started filming stitching this part right here, I had already done the pine tree and one side of the big tree. So as you're coming up this side, remember you're not going back up the pine tree again. You're going on the outer edge, so you're going to head for the frame. So you're only going to go up part way until that tree and the frame meet, and from that point on, you're going to head around the frame and not the tree. I've also been turning the quilt quite a bit so that you have a better view. It's not necessary to do that. So this is our fully stitched trapuntoed area. I find it very helpful to turn it upside down and look at the batting. That way I can see my stitching a lot better than I can on the front. This is just a safeguard to make sure I've gotten everything. Now, if you can think back to when you were little and you had your Easter basket, do you remember digging through the Easter grass to make sure that you didn't lose a jelly bean down on the very bottom? Little did you know you were in trapunto training at that time, because that's how you're going to get to the fabric that's hidden underneath the batting. You're just going to keep pulling away at the batting and pulling away at it until you can get your finger under there and feel the fabric. That's when you can start snipping away the batting. Once you've gotten to that point, you're just going to carefully trim out each of the sections that are in the sky area, from the sky up to the frame, like you see in this photograph. Take your time. You've done great so far. You don't want to mess up now. The worst thing that could happen is if you would accidentally snip your fabric. So always make sure you're taking your time and you're being cautious. I like to lay it on a flat surface so I don't have to worry about fabric being bunched up on my lap. But whatever works for you is the right way for you. So just take your time. It'll be fine. And when you're all finished, that's what it's going to look like. Now next week, you need to have your quilt ready to go. That means your backing, your batting, and your trapunto top all pinned together and ready to roll. See you then.